What's up, guys? It's Rowan
and Terry
here from ArtofSmartTV with another episode of
HSC Economics Review.
So, right now is probably the best time to be studying HSC Economics because so much is happening, both domestically and globally. Now, it might be not a great time if you're investing or otherwise because, the market's so volatile, but volatility is amazing for a HSC Economics student because it gives you so much you can talk about. The problem is you've got to stay on top of everything that's actually going on, so it makes life a little bit harder. So in this episode, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing a state of the global and Australian economy check-in. So we're going to be looking at what's been happening globally and domestically, give you the complete rundown, the key things that you need to know, so that this is the one thing that you can watch that's going to get you up to date incredibly quickly on all the stats and key information you need to really bring it for your HSC Economics essays, short answers, assessments that will be coming up in the coming months. So to kick things off, we're going to look at the state of the global economy. We're going to look at big picture, some of the major economic events that have been occurring and do a little bit of a dive into some key economic zones and economies. And then we're going to transition and look at the Australian economy and look at some of the key data points that are emerging there as well. So to dive in for today, let's kick off with the global economy, Terry. And how did we go in 2019?
Not well, to be quite honest. In 2019, we tailed off with 3% growth. I think we started the year, closer to 3.5, 3.6. We went all the way down to 3. Did we even end up hitting 3?
Yeah, look, I've seen conflicting data on this actually. In sort of trying to do a bit of a deep dive on this, I saw data that seemed to indicate we sort of hit 3.1, globally. But I did see some that indicated even as low as 2.2. Right? Now, my gut tells me the 3.1 just because I want to be optimistic is the more accurate. But I think you're right. It was interesting that global growth was forecast to be 3.5% at the start of the year by the IMF. And then as the year went along, they downgraded it. And in the end, they downgraded it to what it hit, right? But I love it. They downgrade it when it's not really a forecast anymore. It's like, our forecast is 3 and we're going to hit 3. I think what I'm interested in that, though, is how did that compare just to, just the trend?
It's been the worst, actually, since the GFC. And so we're not looking good moving forward, but yet we've just come and put out a 3.4% projection for this year.
Which is really interesting, isn't it?
And I'm just curious, was that made before or after the coronavirus?
That was before. So this is the IMF, they've done their updates. Okay. They've made this before.
Yeah. Have they come out with anything since?
No, not yet.
Okay.
It'll be interesting to see. But I think what this highlights, and again, it's a point we've made in prior videos, is, this is the worst the global economy has been since the GFC. So once again, this is pre-coronavirus, right? So we don't have a big event, right, that's already caused this. It's just, this slow depression that's occurring. Now, depression's not the right word. We're not in it, right? But it's like this
slow grind.
Yeah.
Like you just...
Yeah, exactly. Rather than this big thing. Now, the challenge with that is, in some sense, a big event is easier to fix. You know what happened, right? You know, therefore, the changes you can make. When we're in this sort of situation, it's a little harder to know. Yeah. So, what's some of the things that have been maybe informing this slowing growth at a global level?
Well, most of the studies have shown that it's the major advanced economies that really didn't pick up their slack. They're in large levels of debt, central banks with running out of tools to use with their cash rates on the floor. So they really didn't grow as well as they did. They should have in 2019.
There have been some little windows of hope, though.
Yeah.
Right? And I think if we look at it, just so that we've got a good sense of what's been happening, there has been some major movement, particularly on a trade perspective. Not all good, but there's been some major movement globally with trade with some of our major economies. So I think the big thing, the US signed, phase 1 of a partial trade agreement with China. So, it's almost, it's still a truce, really, if we're being honest, in terms of the US-China trade and technology dispute. But that's been a really big initial sort of a little bit of pressure being released from the global economy. Despite, I think, the fact that ultimately the tariffs remain the highest they've been in 30 years. So I think that's been interesting. I think the US also renegotiated their US-Canada-Mexico free trade deal, which is going to replace NAFTA. But we have still seen, the US economy, despite some of these, slow, haven't we? So it's been, 2.3% slowing, which is, I think, really interesting. Now, what about China? We've seen the US economy have some of these trade deals happen. They're putting off and they're still having some possible action with the EU, but US is slowing. What's going on with China?
China, obviously, even before this outbreak of coronavirus, had gone through 2019, just slugging along, slowing down to around 6%, which is the lowest they've had, since 1992. So they've really rode that high and then just kind of come crashing down. And it'll be interesting to see how coronavirus affects it, simply because China's so interconnected with the rest of the world, and if other countries shut their door almost in the way that Australia has, that could have major impacts on their performance as well.
That's right. And so then we've got, if we look at some other economies in the mix, we've got actually a trade dispute still going on between Japan and South Korea. So, there's also a lot of risk and uncertainty around the semiconductor industry, which, just powers so much of the computers that we use. So, we've had that happen. I mean, what about Brexit? We've had some stuff happening finally on Brexit. It's been years in the making.
Yeah. So Boris Johnson, right, got us into
our buddy Boris.
got us into the process of transitioning. So, the UK has left the European Union. They're officially in their transition period. And I think they've wanted to get it done quickly, and they've wanted to get a trade agreement running between them and the EU organised as soon as possible. Any stats for the UK that you've got there?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting is that the uncertainty, and I think that's the huge thing that we want to highlight. You can't underestimate the impact uncertainty has on economic growth. And that's what the coronavirus, I think, potentially brings as a huge issue. The uncertainty of Brexit, is it going to happen, is it not, has resulted in economic growth being 1.3%, down on the prior year for the UK. But particularly the big thing is that commentators have said that the uncertainty has basically shrunk the British economy by 2.5%. Compared to if it had just continued as part of the European Union. So again, I think the thing to highlight though is that there is definitely some uncertainty around the long-term impact. I've seen very different things. I've seen on the one hand, people are still arguing that, the British economy will be 3 to 4% worse off under a separate trade deal with the European Union as opposed to being part of it. But I've also seen other commentary that has highlighted that, given real concerns about some of the economies in the EU, that actually maybe Britain will be better off long term as they renegotiate new trade deals with other partners. But either way, the short term impact has been a drag on the UK's growth. What about some of the other economies? So, what about, we've got France, some stuff going on there as well.
Yeah, so we've had some strikes in France just because of their pension reforms and just some tension there. Then we also had the Iranian army, I believe. They launched some missiles into some US bases in Iraq. And so that, it just feels like everything's just been compounding. Every couple of days there's just something new going on. And of course, India's
growth is slowing as part of this as well, and that's been a domestic demand weakness, which has really been the case across the advanced economies and largely.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of people were expecting India to kind of pick up the slack from China, which has just simply not happened at this point in time.
Right. So it really does feel like, if we look at the global economy, it does really feel like every week there's like another catastrophe crisis below. And I think the impact on consumer confidence is just humongous. Like so many people, not just because of the virus itself, although certainly that's added to it, have been cancelling over, even pre-virus, cancelling travel. Just because of uncertainty, around, political and economic environments.
And then they see what's going on at home, right? So not only, when you open the news and look at the international global economy, we've also had issues here, right? So, domestically, right, we've entered our 29th year of consecutive growth. But, as we've been saying, that seems to be quite
precarious, right? Yeah, so I think what's interesting is, we hit, 1.7% yearly growth end of last year, which didn't look too bad. But I think if we dive in, what are some of the concerning indicators that sit underneath that?
So as you mentioned earlier, consumer confidence fell. I think, would you say it was 16?
So yeah, consumer confidence has fallen. If we look at the
6%,
sort of 6% over the year, if we look at the Westpac Consumer Sentiment Index, which is quite considerable. It was almost 1.9% fall in December alone. So this is pre-corona, right? It's already plummeting and going through the floor. And I think you see that because you see that in the fact that household income rose by 2.5%, largely due to tax cuts. But on the flip side, what happened to household saving?
Household saving actually increased by 4.8%. And I think on that topic of the tax cuts, people were just really looking to pay off more of their debt rather than then increase their borrowing or increase their spending.
That's right. I mean, some data emerged that with mortgage holders, only 10% of mortgage holders actually took the opportunity with the rate cuts to reduce their repayments, which was the intent of the rate cuts. In terms of the transmission mechanism, the intent was that way there would be an increase in disposable income that would go to consumption. But that hasn't happened. And I can understand why. I mean, when you've got so much uncertainty happening globally, as soon as you get an increase, and domestically, as soon as you get an increase in your disposable income, are you going to use that to buy more, or are you going to use that to pay down debt because you're uncertain about your future earning capacity? I think it makes sense that we see that data play out. What was helping growth then for Australia?
Well, mainly just really from the public sector, government spending, as well as the overseas sector with net exports. So I think here with government spending, we had lots of investment in last year's budget in terms of infrastructure, giving us, and net exports as well, just with the strong commodity prices that followed due to our really attractive Australian dollar. But obviously, I really question whether that net exports is going to really have much of an effect this year, just because of, like we said, coronavirus.
That's right. I mean, coronavirus is expected. I mean, the SARS epidemic in 2003 took 0.25% off our economic growth. It had significant impact on, a tightening of exports. So I think there is a real risk here that we're seeing, our service exports in tourism and education, and even our iron ore, as coronavirus impacts China's growth trajectory, mean that we're going to see a real tightening of the impact and a reduction of the impact that trade is having in supporting growth right now. So it is concerning if we look at the domestic perspective, and again, the data is not quite there yet, but it certainly indicates that we're going to see really a slowdown in the participation or the contribution that exports are having to growth.
But hopefully, just with the bushfire recovery and the rebuilding process, and hopefully maybe that can take over a little bit.
There is a $2 billion, the government fiscal response. So the Morrison government has put $2 billion in, and up to $500,000 loans for businesses. And so the hope is, maybe a little bit of extra fiscal stimulus is going to help.
I think that's what the RBA has been clamoring for us for quite some time already.
That's right, and in some sense, it's given the Morrison government a good excuse, because they're still trying to maintain, if we look at policy response really quickly here, they're still trying to maintain their surplus budget. You listen to Josh Frydenberg, any of the speeches or, the presentations that he gives, and it's still a strong commitment. But if anything, the fires have given him a little bit more of an excuse to spend some more, excuse/extreme political pressure. So, that's, I guess, a little bit of the economic growth situation. In saying that, the RBA still believes that we've reached a gentle turning point. They still expect the economy to grow 2.75% in 2020 and 3% in 2021. And just looking at Terry's expression there, I think we both probably in agreement that. How likely do you think that is?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, we've just consistently not been hitting our targets, and for a year with this much that's already happened, it's just February, right? It doesn't fill me a lot of confidence.
The way that I almost view it, if we look at the RBA right now, and as we've talked about in prior episodes, a lot of this is jawboning, positivity to try to lift confidence, and certainly don't detract from the purpose of that as a strategy. But if we look at 2019, the forecast the RBA had at different points in time was 2.25 to 2.3. We hit 1.7, so we're about 0.6% behind. So if we look at the estimate of 2.75, I mean, even optimistically, we might hit 2.1. But I think given coronavirus, given bushfires, given ongoing drought, that's probably still not even very likely if, we're talking about 1.7 plus we add these factors to the table. What about our unemployment?
So
where are things at?
Unemployment did actually show some encouraging signs towards the end of 2019. It actually fell from, I think, 5.3 to 5.1% in the December quarter. But I believe, Rowan, you had something there. That was quite misleading, wasn't it?
Well, look, I think a big kick up is that, you do get a lot of employment through Christmas casual work. And so, there were, I think, 40,000, new jobs that were filled during that period. And yes, there was a growth still in full-time and part-time, but the biggest growth in that uptick came from casual roles. Yeah. So again, it's a very seasonal sort of uptick. You would expect that really by the beginning of, the sort of the June quarter, that you would start to see, the data coming through for unemployment on the uptick again. Yeah. And we may see it as early as the March quarter. As well as, people get laid off again, in sort of Feb. So I think what's interesting is we should look at really some of the leading indicators on where unemployment's going. Right? And so what is one of those typical leading indicators that we can look at to get a sense of the future of where unemployment might be?
Job ads. Right? And so job ads are 12.6% lower than what they were a year ago. And when you think about it, less jobs available for people to apply for means less people getting hired, and therefore unemployment increases. They simply can't find, because remember, our definition of unemployment for this course is people who want to work but cannot find work. Can't really find work if there's no ads out there, can you?
That's right, exactly. And I think it's interesting because the Centre of Future Work, looking at job ads as this leading indicator of unemployment, have done some analysis that have identified that they expect that if the trend continues as it has, that unemployment will reach over 6% in 2020. Now, we've got to remember that the RBA only recently, second half of 2019, revised the NAIRU as well. So historically, if we had a NAIRU of 5% and we start creeping up towards 6%, it's not ideal, but we're still not that far off our NAIRU, where now we're looking at 4.5. If we're getting close to 6, that's a 1.5% gap. And if spare capacity has already been such a problem in the Australian economy, and if you're not familiar with this idea, go and look at our labour market episode that we covered. The basic premise will be that we're getting more spare capacity. It's going to continue to lead to low wage growth, which in turn impacts consumption. What about youth unemployment? I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting here is, and the economics course itself really does try to look at specific sectors of the economy or groups within the economy that get impacted. What's the data seem to indicate for youth unemployment at the moment, Terry?
So youth unemployment, we're talking here about 15 to 24-year-olds, and it's actually continuing to increase. All right, so we've got here that it's risen by 0.3% percentage points in 2019, right? Which means that. And most of these are just people who are just finishing their studies and coming out and trying to look for a job, but they're unable to find it. And so what that really says is that this is not a strong economy. And if we are, as the Centre for Future Work's Jim Stanford says, if we really are teetering on the edge of a recession, youth are really usually the ones who are laid off first, right? It's the casuals, the part-times who are laid off first. So I think that could probably really explode, right?
And that's it. I think that's why you can also see potentially in some cases very quick changes in the unemployment rate over time as well, because inherently as we become more casualised, the strength of that in downturns is that the workforce can be a little more flexible. That can also sometimes immediately be, a negative though, because it means that you can see a quicker shedding of employment, so to speak, and a quicker uptick in the unemployment rate. So, what about inflation? If we're looking at the sort of the big three of, these economic issues, where's inflation at?
Inflation looked quite good at the end of 2019, right? The CPI rose 0.7% in the December 2019 quarter, bringing it to 1.8% year on year. And that was actually after a pretty strong September quarter as well. But again, really shaky foundations here.
Yeah, that's right. I think the foundations here are really concerning because, the RBA and Governor Lau spoke a lot last year in 2019 about how they were going to try to turn inflation around, given that we've been in such a low inflation environment. And the big thing that they highlighted was that the main challenge was our incomes weren't going up quick enough because there was spare capacity in the labour market. And so what we've just talked about is growing spare capacity. So if anything,
It's probably going to get worse.
Exactly, we're going to see it being even harder to push inflation up unless the coronavirus drought fire impact reduces, supply of goods and services, right? And then we're seeing maybe some inflationary pressure occur just simply because we're seeing the supply curve, move to the left, right? We're seeing a reduction of supply, which is creating a little bit of inflationary
But you
pressure.
really wouldn't want that.
Well, that's it. It's not a good outcome. Yeah. It's not a good way to create inflationary pressure.
Because we're not here just chasing numbers for the sake of chasing numbers, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, and I think the consequence of that and the problem of that, and that's actually a really big risk that we face, because if that does happen, we actually face a situation where we've got growing inflationary pressure with spare capacity in the economy, which means eroding real value of income, right? Our real incomes are going to erode. So the purchasing power falls, which in turn then leads to less consumption. So it could actually create a pretty sort of nasty cycle.
Yeah.
So we really want to hope that doesn't happen. And the pundits' expectations about our speed of recovery from Corona and the factories reopening and Governor Lowe's expectations that the farms will return to business as usual fairly quickly. We really hope that proves to be true. Now, just to sort of highlight what's some of the triple whammy impact here of Corona, drought, and fires, because we've been talking about it integrated, because obviously it plays a big role. And if you haven't already, we've actually done if you haven't seen it, we've done a whole episode on this that we've already released, guys, as well, if you want to dive deep into the triple whammy impact. But for today, what's the sort of quick overview here?
Okay, so coronavirus, again, no one really knows for sure what kind of impact that's going to have, but so far some projections have got, for Australia's economy, 0.4% wiped off of GDP. The droughts themselves, we've got about 0.2, 0.25%, and that's again continuing even despite the rain, right? So if you guys remember the heavy rain, a lot of it actually just concentrated on the east coast, so not really helpful for a lot of farmers further inland. And finally with the fires, that's going to wipe off 0.1%, but I think as of today, there were no more active fires.
That's right.
Hopefully that stops at 0.1. So Rowan, do some maths for me.
Look, it's sort of around about the 0.7, if we can add all of this up. And that indicates that we've just talked about a shaky fundamentals, right? We've talked about things look good on the surface, but the fundamentals are shaky. Yeah. This hits, it really does, sort of threaten, the extent to which we maintain our consecutive quarters of economic growth. And I just want to flag, we did an episode at the tail end of 2019, early 2020, where before, we shot it prior to the fires being of a significant impact. We shot it before the significant coronavirus outbreak. And it was interesting because even at that point, looking at the fundamentals, we raised the question of a recession in 2020. And what we had highlighted there was, look, maybe not a recession, but falling economic growth, slowing. We didn't think that it would necessarily meet the expectations that the positive expectations and forecasts that the government had. But the thing that we did highlight in that video was that all of that was subject to global shocks. Right? We highlighted that maybe there's an oil shock, something happens globally, and it could happen. And we haven't had oil shock. Yeah. We've had the coronavirus. And so, it's going to be really interesting to see to what extent that plays out.
Really sucks that we were right.
Yeah, it's not a good thing. I know it might seem like I'm pumped that we were right, but it's not a good thing. Yeah. Now, I just want to flag in all of this a little bit of a quick sort of conversation around the housing market and the impact all of this is having on the housing market, because it's something that we see in the news almost every week. There's an article that's looking at housing market. It's obviously playing into a lot of our expectations around consumer confidence and monetary policy. One of the things, what has happened? Let's start there.
So I think we began last year just talking about how housing prices were due for a correction, and I think most people were quite reasonable and rational, and they knew it was just a correction of a really big rise. And yeah, it since then has picked up pace again. It's increased 4.1% throughout 2019.
And that's despite quite a dip as well, right? So it means that I believe it was the quickest turnaround almost in the history of the Australian housing market. There might be one other time that it was quicker, but almost one of the quickest turnarounds.
Which is, very interesting, because I just almost feel like this housing market's evolving into its own little bubble, right? And so there's the rest of the Australian economy, and then the housing market.
That's right, and it's, I think, a really interesting point, because what I've seen emerge is this idea of two-speed economy that economists are talking about. And most of the time, they're actually referring to public versus private, right? The public demand driven by the government expenditure driving growth, and private demand really suppressed and dragging the economy. But I think you also see this here with consumer sentiment being incredibly low, yet housing prices continuing to go up. And so you do see this real sense of this sort of two-speed economy starting to emerge. Now, the thing I find interesting, though, about all of this is that typically when you get part of the transmission mechanism for monetary policy is that when you see the cash rate fall, you generally got the asset price effect, or the asset channel, which is that you see asset values increase, which is certainly what's happened. 2 successive rate cuts last year has, I think, contributed to a little more heat in the market. But what should happen is that people feel wealthier, right? That's the whole point of it. And by feeling wealthier, they start to spend more. We haven't seen that happen.
Yeah. So, yeah.
What's going on there?
Well, I think just to come back to this idea of low consumer confidence, right? Because I think people are really, there's a growing number of people who just focus on their housing assets and their mortgages, and they're not particularly interested. I think a lot of those ideas might be a bit dated now, just because of just that we're in a different global economic environment with the low cash rates and whatnot. I think consumption automatically following through a transmission mechanism may not necessarily happen now and probably in the next couple of years.
So I think that's interesting. I think that's exciting again for anyone studying economics during this period, because we're really starting, I think you're right, to see a lot of challenges to the economic theory. That's
wasn't like that when we did it.
No, it was like, this is the theory, and actually that's what is happening in the economy right now. So yeah, it makes it a little more complex, certainly, to understand, but I think definitely much more interesting.
Yeah. And lots of opportunities just for you to really express your knowledge in essays.
That's it. I think if anything, what this does for the motivated students is that it gives you greater opportunities to stand out. Yeah. When Terry and I sat the course itself, you didn't have that opportunity, because this is the theory, this is the policy. There's, it's actually playing out in the same way that was expected. There's not a lot that I could say that was a little, scathing criticism, novel, whatever it might be. Where now you've got much more flexibility for that, which I think is really fantastic. So, any final comments, Terry, about the state of the global and Australian economy?
Doesn't look good.
We got Mr. Optimistic over here.
What about you?
I can't say much more as well. I think it's definitely going to be a challenging 2020, globally and domestically. So look, guys, if you have any questions about this, leave it in the comments below. If you have any further comments, about your own analysis that you'd like to make about things that are going on in the domestic global economy, leave it in the comments below as well. It's going to help other students and teachers that are also watching this episode. Of course, we have referenced a couple of other episodes in this video. If you need to learn more, go and check out the episodes on the impact of the coronavirus and the bushfires and the drought. Go and check out our episode on will the economy hit a recession in 2020. Go and check out our episode on the state of the Australian labour market. They're all really key episodes that are going to help you actually have a much better, more synthesized understanding of the Australian economy. Finally, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. We do videos every single week. We'll see you
next time.